thank Forus for the opportunity to speak uh, to the findings of the report. So, Deirdre, well, congratulations on a great report, and I think what I'm going to say is going to resonate a lot with what you've already articulated so well in your presentation. So, just to take a step back, really about civic space, I think. If we look back at the formulation of Agenda 2030, this was a major demand that came from civil society, uh, and really it was the culmination of several efforts by civil society organizations working together across the world to achieve Goal 16. And of course, we would have liked that Goal 16 would have a stronger articulation of what civic space means. The ability to organize, to participate, and to communicate without hindrance, and essentially the freedoms of expression, association, and peaceful assembly. But we do have this broad, articulation under Goal 1610, as Deirdre has already, demonstrated, which says ensure access to information and fundamental freedoms. Now, it's something that we can live with, and I'll speak a little bit in the about the indicators to this. But civic space is also supported by SDG 16.17, 16.7. Sorry, that's a small mistake there on my presentation. It should be 16.7, which is responsive, inclusive, participatory, and representative decision making at all levels. And importantly, through 17.17, which speaks to encouraging and promoting effective public-private, and most notably civil society partnerships. Now, taken together, these goals definitely, provide a broader framework for us to protect and promote civic space. But we also need to make a compelling case within civil society about why Goal 16 is so important. It really is the key to unlock the potential of Agenda 2030, because if we don't have civil society actors, able to exercise their civic, their rights within enabled civic spaces, participation, accountability, and transparency on Agenda 2030 is going to suffer enormously, and so will in the implementation, especially as we are going into this decade of implementation of Agenda 2030 this year. So, but could I just move to the next slide? So, civic space is so critical, as I just mentioned, to the achievement of Agenda 2030, and really, we have been doing some research at Civicus through our participatory platform, the Civicus Monitor, which has about 20 plus research partnerships around the world, to understand and examine what is the state of civic space in the world. And we use a number of indicators, and we also draw upon the work of other organizations. And we have developed an indicator system which looks at civic space in 5 different and nuanced categories, from open to closed. So you'll see in the countries in the red, and the darker the color means the bigger the challenges, and you see, so the countries in red are the categories in the closed categories, where civic space is almost non-existent practically. And then you'll see then there are countries in the orange category, which is where civic space is repressed. And then is the obstructed category, which civic space is yellow. So obstructed, repressed and closed categories are extremely challenging. And then you have this lighter green, which is the narrowed category, and the darker green, which is the open category. And these are the countries where we believe are meeting the minimum standards under international law to protect the freedoms of expression, association, and peaceful assembly. And I'll just demonstrate in my next slide the extent of the challenges. So, what is the state of civic space? According to our research, only 3% of the world's population living in 43 countries. We cover all UN member states, plus Kosovo, Palestine, and Taiwan. And only 3% of the world's population actually live in countries where these 3 fundamental civic freedoms are adequately protected in line with international standards, and despite the fact that they are part of the constitutions of almost every country. And this is a challenging picture if we look at the global scenario, that and shows that we have a lot more work to do a lot more ground to cover to ensure that there's adequate civic space where civil society can actually engage in proper partnerships and where they can be responsive, inclusive, representative decision making at all levels as guaranteed by Agenda 2030. Next slide, please. So, you know, one is we already were living in a situation of challenging civic space conditions, and the presentations and the slides that I showed you was civic space conditions from an annual report that we produced on the Civicus Monitor, which comes out in December each year, and that was the state of civic space before the COVID-19 pandemic hit us. And we've been doing some research which shows that how civic space has been impacted as governments have moved to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. And we produced two policy briefs. And the policy briefs that I'm going to speak to on the current slide is the one we produced in April 2020, about a month after the World Health Organization had declared COVID-19 to be a pandemic, just as governments were scrambling to respond and trying to understand how COVID-19 spreads and what can they do to protect their populations. And immediately after, in a month after the pandemic had been declared, we found that many governments had put in place broad emergency powers to restrict, the freedoms of expression, but also the assembly and association, and also the right to movement. And in several instances, this led to increased powers of law enforcement agencies, and we found that in many places, police were misusing their power. They, people who they perceived to be overstepping the limits of the restrictions they had placed, or in some instances, they were using it to silence dissent, and which is a challenge. And we also found that in many instances, governments had stepped up their moves to censor what information the media could publish, what information could be released to the public. And as every government tried to put their best foot forward, there was an increase in propaganda and a restriction of information. And there was also more worrying challenge where surveillance in the name of contact tracing, in making, in controlling the spread of the pandemic, almost became very commonplace. And this has a lot of ramifications for the right to privacy, and especially those who seek to defend civic freedoms, who speak truth to power, who may be engaging in constitutional activities that the governments would like to suppress, in a sense, particularly when you criticize state agencies. So there were some serious challenges where activists had posted critical comments on social media, and they were persecuted. They were summoned to police stations, and some of them had criminal proceedings launched under them. You can read more about this on the website of the Civicus Monitor under our COVID-19 April 2020 brief. So what I'm going to speak in my next slide is a follow-up. So, after April, we also continue to monitor the situation with regards to COVID-19, and we've recently released a brief in October 2020, now that we've had another 6 months of the pandemic, and just to understand how the situation fares for civic space. One thing we found, and which has been refreshing to know, that's, despite the spate of restrictions, despite emergency measures introduced in many parts of the world, civil society has continued to actively use civic space, has actively continued to mobilize in defense of democratic rights, in defense of constitutional guarantees, in defense of gender justice, in defense of equality, and against discrimination. There have been many innovative protests, for example, putting crosses in front of government hospitals, just to show that government hospitals and government buildings, just to show the inadequacy of the government response in many instances to civic space restrictions. I meant more government buildings, sorry. And also in other instances, people have come out on their balconies. They've made noise. They've used music concerts. They've used online convening. So civic activism is continuing despite the apparent restriction on the freedom of peaceful assembly. But there have also been protests. There have been protests for constitutional rights. There have been protests for racial justice around the world, but these, because of the general situation of a retreat from democratic values, which is part of larger civic space trends, where we have the rise of the phenomena of strongman leaders who of course like to rule by decree. We found that in many places that where there were protests, that these protests were disrupted, and governments were using the excuse of security measures, of using safety, public safety, or because of the the use of media, when media cycles were focused on COVID-19 restrictions and in rising death tolls in many countries, there were also dismantling of people's right to activism that happened under the cover of the COVID-19 pandemic. As I mentioned before, many governments have really ramped up their propaganda machinery. Strongman leaders particularly like to promote a good picture of their response. And they like to ensure that, that any criticism of their government is muted. So there's a real solidification of media restriction that is going on, where a lot of disinformation is also put out together in support of the government response, but also those who criticize the official response are also facing lots of persecution, and emergency powers continue in many cases. Although civil society has been able to get some governments through public pressure to discount some of the emergency powers that are there. But there remains a challenge because there are many activists around the world who have exercised their constitutional freedoms of expression, association, and peaceful assembly, and have been faced with judicial persecution for that. And their health and death remains a matter of risk in many parts of the world as COVID-19 continues to spread through prison systems. So, can we move to the next slide, please, Arno? So what can we do? Deirdre has already shared some really good examples of what more should we be doing. But we really need to, as civil society, I would say, make a compelling case of why without civic space, it's very difficult for civil society to actually be a good partner of governments in ensuring implementation of Agenda 2030. We really need to make a compelling case that civic space is the key to unlocking the potential of Agenda 2030. If governments are serious about accountability, transparency, participation, all the things they promised at the time Agenda 2030 was put in place, we need to make a more concerted effort on civic space. In fact, what's been very challenging is that the SDGs have oftentimes been cherry-picked. Governments like to have favorite goals, and oftentimes they don't focus on issues like civic space, which are more sensitive, which may make them look bad. So we really need to ensure that civic space is put front and center for Agenda 2030 and really is considered to be key to achieving it. What's happened in the COVID-19 pandemic is, as civil society organizations have scrambled to provide response to populations at risk, whether it's minority populations, whether it's migrant populations, whether it's LGBTQI communities, whether it's impoverished communities, if people who are facing unemployment. Governments have welcomed civil society response to that, but they've also tried to sort of push civil society's role as somewhat as a service provider, as a humanitarian responder, while trying to downplay civil society's role as a watchdog, as a check on the overreach of power, and we really need to also ensure that while we have important service delivery roles, while we have important humanitarian response roles, civil society's role as a watchdog is equally important. And for that, we need civic space to be able to perform that role. We also need civic space actually to fulfill our humanitarian responsibilities and other service delivery roles. But so we need to make a more compelling case on the watchdog role of civil society. Goal 16, as Deirdre said, goal 16 is it needs far more support. It needs far more recognition by governments. It really needs and by other stakeholders. as a cross-cutting goal. It is a goal that impacts on all of the other goals, because if we don't have rule of law, if we don't have peace and justice, we don't have strong institutions, we don't have civic freedoms, it's going to be very difficult to be able to make progress on the other goals. So it's really should be seen as a cross-cutting, as a central goal to achieving the other goals. The SDG indicators that Deirdre said need to be further refined. The current indicator for civic space, firstly, the goal speaks in very broad terms, access to information and fundamental freedoms. It doesn't articulate which particular fundamental freedoms should be protected. If there was a better articulation of fundamental freedoms, we could have had more corresponding goals. But at the moment, just to say that verified cases of killing and kidnapping of human rights advocates, trade unionists, and journalists is a measure of civic space would probably be only a very small part of the picture. And that too, there is not enough information there. And we need proper refinement of SDG indicators. And here, while the interagency expert group on SDG indicators continues its work, there's not been that much progress made on civic space indicators, but governments can still adopt their own indicators. And here it's really important, if democratic governments were to be open and willing to adopt civil society-led indicators, it would help us a lot. There are several civil society and academic indicators. At Civicus, we have the Civicus Monitor, which looks at civic space. We also have other, measures of measuring civic space, like the VDEM indicators. There's the Reporters Without Borders Press Freedom Index, and other indicators that can help fill in the gaps which exist in official indicators. But governments need to be open to accepting well-researched, credible, and independently formulated civil society and academic indicators. So we really need to push for that. And if democratic governments are willing to take the lead and proactively adopt these such indicators, it would be very, very helpful. It could persuade others to do so. And lastly, I think, as I mentioned before, we really need to prioritize the interdependence of the goals. Each goal depends on another for its fulfillment. We cannot have development without peace and justice. We cannot have development without rule of law. We cannot have development without civic space. We cannot have development without adequate civil society partnerships. So that's something that we need to continue to emphasize, and we need to continue to emphasize that the Sustainable Development Goals agenda is the human rights and social justice agenda. There's a reason why there are 17 goals. There is a reason why these 17 goals speak strongly to the human rights agenda. In fact, the Danish Institute of Human Rights has done a study where they've said that over 90% of the commitments in Agenda 2030 directly link up with the International Human Rights Framework. So that is also absolutely critical to formulate. And thank you very much for this opportunity. And I again want to just congratulate Forus and AD on this report that they've put together.
Thank you so much, Mandeep. These are great points. Yes, very true that we need to interlink all the goals, and we are also advocating for reviewing SDG 16 every year, just like Goal 17 that's being reviewed every year. So you see, and one of the questions that I would like to raise that all the tougher goals you see in the VNR, they are just only in the last year of the SDGs. I mean, first at the end of the first cycle, but I see 2021. They're reviewing Goal 16. So again, a very good chance for all of us to work together. So thank you so much again. And so now we have our next presenter, Dima Yered from UN Human Rights Regional Office for Europe. And Dima Yered is a human rights officer at the UN Human Rights Regional Office. As I said, she's from Europe, where she works on strengthening integration of international human rights law in EU law and policy making. Her areas of focus include economic, social, and cultural rights, the SDGs, and the role of local authorities. So Dima, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I don't know if the video is enabled, but I hope you can all hear me.
We do see you.
You do? Okay, great. So it's my pleasure to be here and to participate in this important exchange on the monitoring of civic space, the different tools we have to that end, and what can be strengthened. As just mentioned, I work at the UN Human Rights Office in Brussels. And as most of you are surely aware, the mandate of our office globally is the promotion and protection of the human rights of all. And we have played an active role in both the implementation and monitoring of the Sustainable Development Goals. Our office works at the global level, as well as through our regional and national presences towards several targets under SDG 16. I won't list them all now, but I'll get into it throughout my presentation. So today, as was highlighted by Mandeep just now, it will be my objective to outline some of the core human rights content of SDG 16. Look at how it interlinks with other SDGs and its role in defending and promoting civic space. So next slide, please. As is the case for all SDGs, SDG 16 seeks to realize the human rights of all. The Agenda 2030 is explicitly grounded in international human rights instruments, including the UDHR, international human rights treaties, and the Declaration on the Right to Development. So Agenda 2030 is to be implemented in a manner consistent with the rights and obligations of states under international law. Now, the overarching objective of SDG 16 can be understood to be threefold. Firstly, promoting peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, providing access to justice for all, and thirdly, building effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. Next slide, please. If we look at this third pillar or theme, I'd like to pay a bit of attention to it, which is namely the achievement of accountable and inclusive institutions. This means that member states should work towards the establishment of effective institutions for implementing the SDGs at local, national, regional, and global levels, and ensuring an enabling environment for participation and access to information. This means the establishment of independent national human rights institutions, which are responsible for monitoring human rights and SDG implementation, the establishment of statistical institutes that gather and analyze relevant data, as well as a functioning parliament as a legitimate legislative and oversight body. This third theme also raises issues related to governance and democratic space, budget allocation for the achievement of Goal 16, as well as ensuring responsive, inclusive, participatory, and representative decision-making at all levels. Ultimately, SDG 16 requires that stakeholders have the right resources, policy development processes, and data management capacities to be able to deliver on their promises. And as we will be discussing throughout this session today, civil society and civic space more specifically is critical to the achievement of Goal 16. Next slide, please. I'm sorry, everyone, there's a bit of works being done in the building where I'm speaking from. I hope you can still hear me clearly.
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, great. Thank you. As was just mentioned by the previous speaker, Goal 16 is both an outcome and an enabler of sustainable development. It's considered by many to be a transformational goal towards the achievement of the agenda. And this is because of the critical role of effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions in implementing the SDGs. Next slide, please. So how do we go about measuring SDG 16? As we know, there are 12 targets, and they're of varying scope. Some are narrowly defined, others more broadly. We know there are 12 targets and 23 indicators that cover a range of thematic areas. If we look particularly at target 1610, which is the one we will focus on mostly today, it calls on the state to protect the rights of those who exercise their fundamental freedoms, including freedom of opinion and expression, access to information, and freedom of peaceful assembly and association, which are all enshrined in international human rights law. Commentators have stated that this target is key to the achievement of the whole agenda, because without access to information, individuals are not aware of services and programs being provided. They cannot make informed choices, they cannot hold governments to account, and cannot participate in their development and implementation. Respect for the public freedoms of expression, assembly, and association, and the right to participate are essential for guaranteeing civic space and are prerequisites for responsive and accountable government. Participation allows for more informed decision-making, which in turn enhances the legitimacy of government decisions and gives all members of society a stake in their successful outcome. So civil society has a key role to play to ensure that all of these targets are met. But we also need to look at the relevance of some of these targets for civic space. And we know that civic space shrinks when some of these targets are not met. Before I turn to this topic of this target and civic space monitoring, I just wish to say a few words about the indicators currently under OHCHR custodianship. Next slide, please. OHCHR is the UN system's custodian agency for 4 official SDG indicators. They are under SDG 16 and SDG 10, and they focus on independent national human rights institutions, violence against human rights defenders, the prevalence of discrimination, and finally, conflict-related deaths. For these 4 indicators, the office as a whole is responsible for compiling these indicators at global level and providing technical assistance to countries which produce them at national and regional level. Our office's work on the SDG indicator framework cuts across most SDGs and is underpinned by what we call the human rights-based approach to data, which essentially is a direct extension of the overall human rights-based approach to leave no one behind, focusing on data disaggregation by factors such as sex, gender, ethnicity, disability, to ensure that those suffering from intersecting and multiple forms of discrimination are not left behind. The human rights-based approach to data also requires ensuring that safeguards are put in place to protect the independence of official statistics. So our office works closely with national human rights institutions, statistical offices, rights holders, and civil society in the processes of data definition, collection, and analysis. Next slide, please. Just wish to highlight a few numbers related to the monitoring of civic space so far in the region of Europe, Central Asia, and the Caucasus. From 2015 to 2019, at least 52 human rights defenders, journalists, and trade unionists were killed in the region. There was at least 1 verified case of enforced disappearance among this group, and among those killed, 25% were women. Next slide, please. As we are all witnessing, and as the Forus report and Civic has clearly described, in this region and globally, many societies and communities are experiencing shrinking civic space, and we need to defend this space. In this regard, I'd like to touch on some developments at UN level and the ongoing work of OHCHR. Earlier this year, the UN Secretary General issued a call to action on human rights in order to reinvigorate our pursuit for the rights and values at the core of the UN Declaration, particularly in the light of ongoing backlash against human rights. In this call to action, the UN Secretary General makes civic space and public participation a priority area, reaffirming that the pursuit of fundamental rights and freedoms should be at the heart of UN work. The UN has also recently, just last month, adopted a guidance note on protection and promotion of civic space to guide UN work in protecting and promoting civic space and ensuring increased consistency across the system. The United Nations Human Rights Committee also recently adopted a general comment on Article 21 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is on the right to peaceful assembly. And the comment looks at this right both on and offline. So how should we properly monitor these developments? We've of course already made reference to indicator 16.10.1, which is one indicator aimed at measuring part of the core of target 16.10. And yes, 16.10.1 does have its limits, and we would welcome ongoing work on structural, process, and other outcome indicators. As Mandeep also described, the protection and promotion of civic space can also be monitored by looking at other targets. I would add, in addition to 16.7 and 17.17 that Mandeep already referenced, target 5.5 on women's full and effective participation, and that 16.3, 16.5, 16.6, and 16.b all reinforce each other and refer to the conditions required for an enabling environment that is conducive to participation and to the achievement of other goals. In terms of OHCHR's work, we continue to support and participate in global monitoring efforts on the enabling environment for civic space. We work together with partners to ensure there are stronger laws, policies, and practices protecting civic space, including online. We provide increased, timely, and effective protection to civil society organizations and individuals. We continue to contribute to the Secretary General's report on reprisals. We also collect evidence to show the value of civic space and participation, and we challenge negative human rights narratives. The voice of the High Commissioner is fundamental in this regard. We develop targeted messages on the value of civic space and promote public recognition of the legitimacy and contributions of human rights defenders. We work on data collection methodologies on civic space, on and offline, and strengthen analytical and advocacy tools to make effective use of data to support civic space. OHCHR has also recently issued guidelines for states on the effective implementation of the right to participate in public affairs, and we encourage civil society to use these guidelines to advocate for a more strategic, coherent, and robust approach by states towards implementing the right to participate in public affairs. I will leave it at that, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dima. Yeah, it's very important to look at the other targets apart from SDG 16, and I think that's where the concept of SDG 16 plus has come in. And it's very nice to look at the targets of 1717 and 5.5. Apart from that, there are other goals as well, which are very much related to SDG 16. But to me, it's a good presentation about linking SDG 16 plus civic space and look specifically at these targets. So thank you so much once again. And now we have a presentation from Priya Sood. She's from Global Alliance for Reporting Progress on Peaceful, Just, and Inclusive Societies. Priya is the coordinator of the Global Alliance for Reporting Progress on Peaceful, Just, and Inclusive Societies, which is a multi-stakeholder platform focused on strengthening, monitoring, and reporting on SDG 16. She has 20 years of experience working in the areas of governance, private sector, development and gender equality, international NGOs, and the UN in South Asia, the Middle East, and North America. So Priya, the floor is yours.
Jyotsna, I wonder, could I just intervene, Deirdre, here for 1 minute and just ask that we remind people about the interpretation arrangements. I'm just seeing a few people are asking for translations, so maybe Arturo could remind them. Thanks, Jyotsna.
Yes, thank you, Deirdre. Just to remind everyone that simultaneous interpretation of this meeting is available in English, French, and Spanish. So you need to click on the globe at the bottom right of your screen. And if you need to intervene or if you wish to intervene during this meeting, you can also raise your hand or write in the Q&A box. Petit rappel, une interprétation simultanée de cette session est disponible en anglais, français et espagnol dans l'onglet Interprétation, représenté par un globe en bas et à droite de votre écran. Si vous souhaitez intervenir pendant la réunion, vous pouvez aussi lever la main pour parler et écrire dans la boîte de questions y réponses. Un pequeño recordatorio a todos. Tenemos servicio de interpretación simultánea en español, inglés y francés. Usted puede seleccionar esta interpretación en el icono en forma de globo que tiene en la parte inferior derecha de su pantalla, haciendo clic y seleccionando el canal en español. También puede indicarnos si desea participar levantando la mano. Thank you very much, Jyotsna. Over to you.
Thank you so much. So over to Priya.
Thanks so much, Josna and Deirdre. Thank you to Forus for inviting me to present. As Josna just mentioned, we are the Global Alliance for Reporting Progress and Peaceful, Just, and Inclusive Societies. We're a multi-stakeholder, so member state-led, but very much member state, civil society, private sector, and UN agency coordinating platform to really focus on monitoring and reporting of SDG 16. So I'm grateful for this invitation because it's very important for us to be connected to a wider civil society group and to a very meaningful issue, especially right now in the current realities that we are facing. My intro comments have been mentioned by the previous speakers. So I'll just be very brief because I know we're all in multiple webinars and I'd love to have a more interactive discussion, but I just wanted to reiterate that as of this past summer, June, I'd say and so there's probably more by now, around 100 countries have called for states of emergency in response to COVID-19. And with many using this health crisis to really clamp down on fundamental freedoms around expression, assembly, and civic space. So I think I'm preaching somewhat to the choir. Everyone is on side in knowing that civic space has been shrinking for the last many years since the SDGs were introduced, but even more so now. And this is detrimental to the progress of the SDGs and specifically to SDG 16. Next slide, please. Again, I think while we are really looking at the recommendations of the report that Forus put out, that additional civil space indicators are needed more so. Sorry about that. I have children around, but more so than more specifically than what has been already established. Now, our colleagues at Civicus, there are colleagues at ICNL who have developed indicators that we can already monitor right now. They've put up mechanisms and the links are in my presentation. So I hope the presentation is shared. Specific monitoring tools that civil society can use right now to measure what is going on in terms of this indicator. As also mentioned and also new to me, 1610, 16B, of course we know already, while they're not ideal, that they encompass all the indicators that we need to monitor civic space. There is space in those indicators to measure fundamental freedoms and discrimination. And as previous colleagues have mentioned, 16.7 and also 17.17. Thirdly, I'm going to slow down here because I realize I do talk fast and I do know that the translators are working very quickly. Thirdly, the monitoring of country-specific indicators. Now, there's always space, and I do know that countries themselves are creating their own priority indicators. So fully encouraging civil society to advocate in country for that their governments look at creating new data sets that are specific to the needs that are being threatened in that country. Finally, on this slide, I wanted to mention that there is a new UN system-wide guidance on civic space. I was trying to look for a link for it, but I don't think it's been shared widely. It does not mention monitoring, but I would welcome a community that starts advocating, and I think there was a question in the Q&A, start advocating to the UN system about creating some indicators, a UN sort of system around monitoring of civic space as another way to continue this conversation and to press the international community on these issues. Next slide, please. Now, I spoke to some members over the summer quite a bit about the VNR process. The Global Alliance is supporting VNR countries in providing knowledge resources. And one of the recommendations coming out of the report is to establish another international level to facilitate governments and other diverse stakeholders to focus on monitoring and consultation activities related to civic space. Yes, ambitious. I think while it's a lofty goal, I think there's already so many reporting instruments for governments right now in terms of the human rights reports, as well as the VNRs, that I'm encouraging, we as a Global Alliance are encouraging utilizing the VNR process to monitor very closely and to improve the stakeholder engagement. So specifically during the design process, there are opportunity to expand stakeholder engagement and to advocate that civil society be at the table when the VNR plans are being put in place and when the development and VNRs are being designed. So what does that look like? Further in the slides, I can talk to some specific examples, but really bringing civil society into the conversation of the development of the data and the data creation that is needed. The additional priority that civic space is shrinking and that further indicators need to be developed. This is the time to start that conversation during the design phase. Delivery at HLPF, I know there's been a lot of discussion about having civil society participate in either separately in presenting spotlight reports, but which is also something that is fully supported. But what's happening now is that in some cases, civil society representatives are part of the formal delegation and are able to present with the member states or be part of that delegation. So again, there's an entry point there for civil society to be present and continue to advocate for specific monitoring of specific goals on SDG 16. Finally, I mean, the VNR is great. It's a great process, but it's not, the presentation is not the end of that process. And we are fully advocating for links of the recommendations coming out of the VNR into the follow-up national development plans and priorities. And connected to that, the stakeholder engagement that was developed in the first phase, in the design phase, the type of consultations that they've done in the first phase, the type of working groups that they've established can continue in this follow-up phase and should continue, again, to get your voice as civil society in there to really speak to some of these civic space indicators. Next slide, please. Here are some examples. We have a guide that was launched in June of this year, and it's short and punchy, I feel, with this, but I do feel like it's something that would be useful for you all to review because it's 20 pages, but it goes through some of the steps, all of the steps that are needed to develop an SDG 16 chapter within the VNR and points of entry in terms of stakeholder engagement. So not only having a chapter in SDG 16, but looking at the interlinkages between SDG 16 and the other recommendations that are being made. There's several examples listed in there. There's two that I've pulled out here that can demonstrate somewhat what civil society can do on the ground to get involved in this process. So Sierra Leone is often one of our success champion countries because they've done a lot of work on SDG 16 and with a focus on access to justice. But in this case, they are showing that civil society took the lead in data collection, holding consultations across 16 districts. And it was primarily data collection, but also towards that data collection was some recognition of what is missing in this data collection and what needs to be further developed. So really looking at the gaps. Of course, they consulted UN agencies, media groups, the private sector, and there's an instrument that is annexed in their Sierra Leone 2019 VNR. They are also going into a VNR next year. So we would be curious to see how they feed in the recommendations from this one into the next one. And again, that through the National Development Plan. Uruguay, interestingly enough, had 4 themes that they felt were a priority. And one of them was access to information, as well as participation and inclusion. And they set up working groups along these lines to further delve into each of these subjects. Again, inviting civil society to join these working groups and advance targets and indicators under these. The final slide, please. There's 2 call to actions, which I'd like to flag. The first one is a Global Alliance call to action in terms of response to COVID-19. If there's certain advocacy principles that you would like to emphasize in some of your remarks going forward as a civil society on the ground, please use it. That's why we've created it. It's very much focused on data collection and disaggregation and monitoring, but it's really looking at multi-stakeholder partnerships, expanding stakeholder engagement, and really looking at a human rights-based approach to data collection. So very much in line with the conversations that we're having today. The second one is Act Now for SDG 16+. That's over 100 organizations have signed on to this statement. It's all encompassing under SDG 16+. There's specific reference to civic space and the need to monitor it and talk about it and see what's going on about it. So I encourage you to sign on and advocate for the points that are made there. And the links again are in this slide, but I can put them in the chat later on. And the next slide, please. There's several resources that are all links here. The one that I was speaking to is the second one on the slide from the left, which is short and helpful right now to the people, organizations working in countries that are going into VNRs next year. It was just announced on Friday. There's 44, I believe, and I'm happy to send out the list of countries. But getting engaged in the conversations now would be smart, because I think by Q1 of next year, they'll be developing the actual report and submitting it next spring. The other one I would like to flag is the one that's coming out at the end of November. And it's really looking at how to mainstream SDG 16 using the voluntary national review. So that's very much feeding into not only the VNR, but what happens after the VNR through a lens of SDG 16, very much looking at participation, access to information, civil society, stakeholder engagement. So I look forward to sharing that information with you as we move forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Priya, for the great presentation. Yes, this is very true that we demand SDGs, we demand the participation from the civil society in the SDGs monitoring and review, and also in the VNR. But as Deirdre mentioned in the very first slide, that no VNR has actually mentioned till date about the shrinking civic space. We heard the stories from OHCHR where they're coming up with this guideline. So I hope that there is more involvement of civil society in SDGs, not only in SDG 16 monitoring, but in other SDGs. And very much looking forward to seeing Sierra Leone, because yes, we know, yes, Sierra Leone is presenting VNR again 2021. So we'll see how they collect the data and how can we replicate. But we also feel that it's also a lot of political will is involved in that, if the government want to involve civil society in this kind of data collection on monitoring, implementation, and review. So with that, we finished the first section, and thank you so much to all the 4 speakers. There are a lot of questions that we are getting, and we will address. I just wanted to tell all the participants here, we are taking note of all the questions, and that would be addressed at the end of the session. And before going into the last segment, we will just get into the 3 question and intervention from 3 panelists. And it would be really nice, panelists, that if you have any comment or if you have any question, so please ask the 4 speakers that you have asked. So our first panelist, I think, because Sarah had already told us she has to leave, so may I request Sarah from Global Focus to make an intervention, and please make sure that it's within 5 minutes. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Yutsna, and thank you very much to Forus for inviting me for this really interesting session. Thank you to all the speakers for your really interesting presentations. And my name is Sarah Brandt, and I lead our civic space work at Global Focus, which is the Danish platform for NGOs. And we certainly want to be very involved with the VNR process of Denmark that is being prepared now. Denmark is presenting a VNR next year at the high-level political forum. Luckily, we have seen from Denmark a lot of leadership with regards to the importance of including civil society at virtual UN meetings such as the HLPF, and we're really happy to see that leadership from their side. But I think what my question is around today is something that's quite related to an issue that we've been facing actually within the last few weeks in Denmark. We have a government now that is very progressive and also really well addressing civic space issues globally in their foreign policy and in their development cooperation policy. The Danish government has decided to issue funding for rapid response, support for human rights defenders and organizations at risk around the world, which is something we're looking to implement soon together with them. They have also decided, as a response to COVID-19, to give more funding to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. So that's really wonderful to see that they're very responsive in terms of what is needed globally. However, what we have seen lately, and actually within the last few weeks, is that at the national level, a new law has just been proposed which will significantly limit civic space in Denmark. And this is not related to COVID-19. Luckily, their COVID-19 response has been quite responsible in terms of still allowing for peaceful protests, etc., even though there were association bans to defeat the virus. But what we're seeing now is that this new draft, which is called a safety package from the Danish government, is actually suggesting that people shouldn't be allowed to assemble in certain places where people feel unsafe because there might be large groups of people gathered at once. They could get a fine for being there, and even if they don't have the money to pay for a fine, the police could decide to take their jewelry or expensive jackets or other things that might be valuable. At the same time, we also see that they're infringing of the rule of law with regards to people who might be charged under this new law, where people would not receive the same access to justice in the court system, where there will be some of the layers that usually is part of the rule of law that will be taken out. And so we're quite worried to see how, while the Danish government is really taking responsibility and leadership on civic space globally, whether it being inclusion of civil society at the UN or whether it being supporting human rights defenders and organizations at risk, we're seeing that at national level, this is not the discourse, and it's not seen as an important issue to protect democracy. And maybe this comes from a position of privilege of thinking that, well, we have democracy in Denmark. We're one of those 3% of the world's population that live in a country that is democratic, and it's fine. So we don't have to protect democracy so much. But we're very afraid of this new approach from the Danish government, and we're trying to see how we can respond. And so for that reason, my question to the different speakers goes on how we can use the upcoming VNR of Denmark to address the national issue, but also underlining this a conflicting way of addressing civic spaces if it is something completely different globally compared to a national level. How can we use SDG 16 and potentially national indicators in Denmark to address this? We are also hoping that civil society will be closely involved in Denmark, and we're certainly trying to push that process off very well from the beginning. But at the same time, we do also see that we don't have a lot of time until the VNR is to be presented in July. And lastly, I want to ask, with regards to OHCHR, is it possible to make contributors aware that they must also ensure civic space nationally? So Denmark is kind of bringing forward the money book and saying we would like to contribute to this, which is something we're really happy with, because it's also something that we have been recommending them to do. But is it possible to just contribute and sort of say that you're a global protector of civic space globally, when indeed you're making the contrary actions at national level? Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. So what we will do, we'll take all the comments and questions by other two panelists, and then our speakers can take their time, about 5 minutes each, to respond to their respective questions. Is it okay? Okay.
Thank you.
So, okay. So now we have other panelist. His name is Pedro Boca from Abong. Pedro, the floor is yours.
Hi, Jostna and everybody. Good morning from Brazil. Everybody's there on time right now. But first, I would like to thank Forus for the invitation to participate as a panelist here, and also salute the speakers who added a lot to the debate. So I will be pretty short, but as being said, and stated by the Forus and ADA report that we participate here from Brazil with our contributions, and I think that everybody here in this panel had already reading it, but if not, you can see what we in Brazil are working on, the SDG 16 and the actual condition of our civil society and the civic spaces right now in our country. But well, in a general context, we are living in a global context of increasing conservatism and governments who are now suffocating civic spaces, as we are talking previously. In relation to the SDGs, the general idea of the implementation of the 2030 agenda is based on governments, whether in active action for the implementation of the agenda through public policies, or by monitoring, especially through the VNRs. But we are living in a condition, and we know that Brazil is not the only country in the world that are living in this way, unfortunately. But we live in a condition in which not only the government does not support the 2030 agenda, doesn't make the VNRs, just have canceled the working groups, and publicly speaks that the 2030 agenda is something that this government did not support, but the government also acts against it, making data monitoring difficult, destroying proactive spaces, and destroying agendas who were established in the recent years. And this process will become even more serious and tragic during the pandemic that we are living now in 2020. So based on this context, and believing that, knowing that Brazil is not the only country who are suffering from governments like this that we have here in Brazil, I would like to hear from the speakers and from the other Forus members who will join us in this panel, how in a scenario that not only we are talking about shrinking civic spaces, but eliminating civic spaces in some countries, how can civil society think of effective actions for a positive agenda in relation to the SDG 16 and the other SDGs? And also think about, and I want to hear from you, is how global civil society can assist and support countries who are facing tough conditions like Brazil and others. How can we build in network building, and to think about collective actions to not only denounce what is happening on these countries, but to do effective actions to not only to talk about that, okay, in these countries we have shrinking civic spaces or we have difficult conditions, but how can we do something as a global civil society to improve democracy and to make sure that we can pressure on the opening of civic spaces in some countries who are facing these tough conditions? Thank you.
Thank you, Pedro. Very valid questions. I hope our speakers are taking note of the questions. And our third panelist is OBC from NNNGO. OBC?
Yes, thank you very much. And a very good presentation by all of the panelists. And I've been able to make a sense of all of the things that they've said. One is the fact that it's very good and interesting to see that we have indicators around civic space by several organizations and institutions. It will be good that we find a way of harmonizing these indicators and in ways that helps us to be able to have all of them in one pack. And those of us at the national level can begin to make use of the indicators. They have to be refined. Again, like I've said, in ways that can ensure that as national associations we can take ownership for that. I think that data tracking for civic space, it will be hard, but I do know that it is doable, especially when you look at the fact that administrative data collection on the part of government is very weak, and also the capacity for civil society itself to also track some of these indicators is also weak. So we'll need to build extensive capacity in that regards. There's a need for civil society organizations working in the areas of service delivery and those that are development focused to actually get more interested in issues around civic space. For many times, we've left these to rights-based organizations, thinking it's their forte. But now we need to let them understand that civic space is cross-cutting across all of our work, and we must all pay attention to it and prioritize it, including documenting bridges to many of these rights within civic space. The diversity of our sector, again, plays a huge role here. And while it has its positives, it also comes with its negatives. And I'm citing the example of the protest that has been going on in Nigeria, for example. While people in the southern part of the country is saying "Hensas," in the northern part of the country, they're saying "Reform SAR." So the diversity itself presents some of the issues. Of course, yes, civic spaces, they're unique in their nature and they're universal. But when you look at issues around freedom of expression, of assembly, and also of opinion, then we begin to see where diversity comes in and the need for us to respect all of that across board. I mean, for example, in Nigeria, and I like the presentation around national human rights commissions, their independence, and also the independence of the statistical offices. There's a need for us to engage more with these two institutions, especially as civil society, helping them to tease out what their role is in the attainment of the SDGs and also in the areas of civic space. One of such is, and this is one indicator that can go into measuring civic spaces, how independent are the national human rights commissions? Are their budgets do they derive their budget from statutory provisions, and is this released in good time? So, for instance, the 2020 budget of Nigeria already makes the Nigerian Human Rights Commission's budget. They budgeted about 3 billion naira for them, and that is coming directly. So as the government is budgeting itself, it's also budgeting separately for the Nigerian Human Rights Commission. And I think this is good for civic space in Nigeria, and we need to look at this across all regions of the world. So these are some of the thoughts that I have at this time. I think we're starting on having this conversation. It will be important that we harmonize all of the indicators that we have and find a way of ensuring that national associations take ownership of this and that they begin to report on this through a mechanism that we can find ways of developing. Over to you.
Hello, Jyotsna.
I think Jyotsna has a little power failure. So what we can do while she's trying to get back the power is to invite the speaker to respond to what has been said by the panel. I don't know who would like to start, maybe. It seems that Jyotsna is back right now. Jyotsna, can you hear us? Try to activate your microphone.
Can you hear me, Arno?
Yes, I can.
Great. Well, I'll step in here just for the moment until Jyotsna gets her power back. So thanks very much. Yeah, so some very interesting points raised there by Oyebesi and Sarah. And I think the panel or the speakers are probably, you know, ready to take on some of those points and respond to them. So Dima or Priya or Mandeep, which would you like to respond, maybe starting with Sarah's point because she was the first maybe to speak. Who'd like to respond to the point about the Danish government?
I can take it. This is Dima.
Great, Dima, thanks.
Thanks for that, Sarah, and actually to all the speakers. And I think one thing that we can consider, as you say, for me, there's 2 points here. One, you mentioned this disconnect between the international reputation or international behavior of a state and then their national behavior, which unfortunately is not specific just to Denmark. I think we see this quite regularly in our work, where a state will put itself as a champion of a certain issue internationally, and then nationally we see quite some significant backsliding. So I can assure you that this is very much an issue that we take seriously and is regularly raised with a member state, either in silent diplomacy when the High Commissioner meets with relevant counterparts at national level, or in public statements, or in other methods of engagement. So it is very much on our radar, and we pay a lot of attention to try to promote this coherence between international and national behavior on human rights. On the specific question of this concerning law, I think it gives me an opportunity to say something I didn't get to say in my presentation, which is to draw your attention and remind some of you about the existence of the human rights mechanisms, which are very much linked to the implementation of the SDGs. And I'm referring, of course, to the treaty bodies that monitor the implementation of the relevant international human rights treaties. So specifically, let's say the Human Rights Committee, or the Committee on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, or the Committee on the Rights of the Child. So that's for the treaty bodies, and there's the special procedures. And then, of course, the Universal Periodic Review, which should be seen as complementary to the VNR and to the SDG implementation process. They all serve each other and reinforce each other. But sometimes when the VNR reporting is not, let's say, covering sufficient issues from the view of civil society, don't forget that you can trigger the different mechanisms, whether it's the relevant treaty body that's reviewing your country, or a special procedure that can undertake a country visit, or the country is up for review under the Universal Periodic Review. So specifically for Denmark, what can work is you contact the Special Rapporteur on freedom of association and assembly, and trigger their or draw attention of that mandate holder to this draft law, where you identify where the problems are, and what the rapporteur can do is send a letter of concern to the Danish government. If through engagement with the government nothing seems to be changing, the rapporteur also has the ability to issue a public statement and put more pressure in that way. So there, and I'm happy to discuss some more of these options with you on the side, but just to say that there are these additional mechanisms in the human rights system that can only help to bolster monitoring of civic space. And of course, Denmark, I see that it has a delay in its reporting under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. It's supposed to issue its list of issues prior to reporting. And I'm not sure that they have been submitted. So we can look at that together separately if you wish. I will leave it at that. And I think that's also something that can perhaps answer the question of Pedro of how global civil society organizations can support each other. I think, trying to put pressure on states through the UPR, through the work of the treaty bodies is a really important avenue. I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dima. I'm not sure is Justna back on the call yet, but I might put the same, or the question, or at least the point made by Oyebesi to Mandeep or to Priya to respond to. So which of you will address Priya's, or address Oyebesi's point?
Priya, would you like to address it or should I go?
You go ahead, Mandeep.
Thanks. Oyebesi, thanks a lot. I think for that question, and and what you raised is a really important point where, civil society organizations oftentimes, create this artificial distinction between service delivery roles and between, and activist roles and, and advocacy roles. And this is also part of the larger framework of even between rights, where civil and political freedoms are somehow seen different from economic and social and other rights. And I think, if anything, that has shown us in the current scenario, that human rights are interdependent. And if you want to make a dent on inequality, or if you want to promote gender justice, or we need to have civic space, we need to have, civil and political freedoms protected to be able to, create the momentum and public pressure that's needed. And I think as civil society globally, and this also feeds into Pedro's point about how do we work together. I think and also about Sarah's point, I would say we really need to mobilize, and we really need to work in solidarity with each other, as we've seen in many parts of the world. Restrictive governments, repressive leaders, they oftentimes borrow from each other's playbook. And they, even we see that when there are laws that restrict, civil society activities or civil society international funding, they oftentimes have a lot of similarities. But we can also learn as civil society from each other's, strategizing, and really the power of international solidarity is enormous in this sense. How when we stand up and we raise our voices, in support of our friends and those who believe in the same values as us, across borders, across continents, there's a certain amount of power in that, and we live in an interconnected world. And I think we also should keep in mind that young people today are far more politically active and politically aware, and are able to harness the power of technology. So we should continue to mobilize and work together. And also, use both international and national mechanisms. I mean, at the international level, it's great that Dima, spoke about how, about the various options that are available through the UN framework. I would say that even nationally, there was, there's the courts and national human rights institutions, and we should, work through them, and while simultaneously, engaging international and regional mechanisms and institutions to push back against repressive measures. And the unfortunate reality of our times is that, there's, as governments have been called upon to balance safety and civil liberties, they have used the excuse of safety oftentimes to impinge on civil liberties, and we really need to remain eternally vigilant. And as as Sarah highlighted, that any country, even if a country is considered to be open or is considered to be democratic, there's always work to be done, and that really, again, highlights the importance of why civic space is so important to protect our hard-won rights as societies. And we really need to continue to emphasize the importance of being able to do this, because if we are not vigilant, our rights can be eroded quite quickly.
Great, Mandeep. Thank you very much for that comprehensive answer. And I see Priya is ready to come in and maybe just to respond, also to the points that Pedro raised. And I think Justin is back on the call, so I'll hand back to her then. So over to you, Priya.
Yeah, I just wanted to emphasize, and I know that the case of Denmark versus the case of Brazil are very different in a sense, but that there is this opportunity, if possible, to look at civil society spotlight reporting. It basically takes a lot of advocacy work on the ground, if possible, that you come together as multiple CSOs and you really look to measure some of the key priorities from the civil society perspective on Goal 16 in the VNRs. What is being measured by the government is one thing, but then what civil society feels is really happening on the ground, and the implications of that. And I will post in the chat box a link to an analysis of CSO spotlight reports. And it's not, I mean, these spotlight reports aren't, the point of them is not to name and shame. The point of them is to really have a constructive conversation with the government about what the civil society feels are the realities, and to try to contribute more effectively to realistic and honest, transparent data collection and monitoring on Goal 16. So that was one thing I wanted to mention. The other is that there's this other tool that's been recently launched. I know there's been a couple of questions in the chat about COVID-19 and how it's making it harder to monitor and harder to collect data, for example, in this online environment, harder to reach those that are not have a digital divide or are outside the current spaces. And there's a tool, a resource that was just put out by the Praia group, city group, a guidance note on collecting governance statistics data, and really looking at ways to do that in this COVID-19 reality. So very specific to the current environments we're in. And I would recommend that you all review it. I'm still reviewing it, so I can't respond in detail, but I think part of the argument is that sometimes survey collection online can ameliorate some of the discrimination that takes place when you're doing face-to-face interviews, when you're doing household surveys and going house to house, and can change the dynamics of the entire collection process. So that's one aspect, but also that you might be able to reach a different audience through the online space that are not usually engaged in the more formal processes. So I'll post that as well. And I just wanted to flag it too, because I think it would add value in terms of the challenges that several the countries on the call are asking about. So I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you so much, Priya. And my apologies for having missed some of the conversation because of power failure here. So thank you. I hope all the questions have been answered by the panelists and by the speakers. Now the question, we'll have a couple of questions from the floor, which were already prepared. And then there are other questions. We will try to address most of them because we have hardly 15 minutes, we will try to address. So quickly, I invite Arjun from NFN, if you have a question. Arjun, do you hear me?
Hello, this is Arjun Phillips from Vani, Josna ji.
Okay, Arjun from Vani.
Yeah,
sorry,
hi.
I know both the Arjuns. Thank you. Yes, Arjun, please go ahead, ask your question.
Yes, thank you. I mean, there's very interesting conversations that we are having, and we're getting perspectives from across the world. My question is directed to the panel on the kind of international financial resources that are non-controversial in nature and which cannot be clamped down by the government, what kind of financial resources can be made available for CSO national platforms that are working specifically around civic space advocacy?
Okay. Any panelists? Okay, can we have one more question now, and then the panelists, the speakers could answer? Can we have the question from Lee?
Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Leah Mitava from Zambia Council for Social Development. So when I look at Goal 16 and the Agenda 2030, in my country, I see that there are certain, again, international processes that have potential to actually stifle civic space. And I'm speaking about the anti-money laundering and combating financing for terrorism, which are coming from the FATF process. In Zambia, we've had an NGO law that was put in place as a result of the FATF process. But of course, maybe government riding on our little understanding around the FATF recommendations, what they did is they went beyond the FATF recommendations and actually developed a law that is going against the recommendations. So whereas the FATF process after revision recommending a risk-based approach to the NPO sector, what we have in Zambia at the moment is government recommending a law that looks at the whole civil society sector as vulnerable to terrorist financing and coming up with laws that are actually closing up civic space. We've done a recent study and we're trying to see how the FATF process, for instance, even at global level, in expecting the countries to report on them, how can they ensure that the processes do not stifle civic space? And I know that this is happening again in a few other African countries because we've had some exchange as countries implementing the FATF processes. So to what extent, for instance, would civil society organizations be able to engage with a FATF global facility to ensure that countries are not using the FATF processes to stifle civic space?
Okay, so we have two questions. Maybe
which then would go against the achievement of.
Okay. Maybe can we have two more questions before we go for final submissions from the speakers and the two questions? Maybe we have a question from Akio from Japan. Akio, are you there?
Thank you, Josna. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Yeah. So I'm Akio, policy advisor of JANIC in Japan, and my question is, of course, this is for Dead Red, but I really like the idea of civic space index. But the question I have is that back in early 1990s, I think UNDP, they developed what they called Human Freedom Index, or if my memory is right, but it didn't last a long time. I think it was there for just 1 or 2 years, and because of all the opposition from the countries that were rated low. So how can we get support of UN member states on this? And also, how can we make this sustainable is the question that I have. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Akio. So now we have three questions. Two speakers. Would you like to address questions? Maybe 2 minutes each?
Sure. Should I go first?
Thank you. Yes, Priya, please go ahead.
In terms of international resources, I think as all of us know, ODA is decreasing. Getting funding from the traditional donors is increasingly more challenging and very much tied to specific political objectives. So our recommendation really would be to look towards more outside the box sources of funding, whether that is through alternative financing options such as foundations who are really looking to support advocacy and civil society engagement through a more neutral lens. So of course there's all the big ones that we hear about, Rockefeller and open government, open foundations. I'm trying to remember the name, but I can't at the moment. But I think going forward, that's our reality right now in this current context. And because civic space is such a sensitive issue and Goal 16 overall is highly sensitive politically, that this would be a way forward. So really looking to national foundations who are supporting this type of work, but also from an international standpoint, as Arjun referred to, really looking to these types of organizations to look for funding. In terms of anti-money laundering and the Financial Action Task Force, I wasn't clear that basically what we're saying, thank you, Open Society Foundation, OSF. That was one of the foundations I was trying to mention. While I'm not a technical expert on these recommendations, I think there's several high-level events going on anti-corruption next year. One is the first, I think, I'm not sure of the exact title again, but it's basically in the lead up to the General Assembly, and it's looking at anti-corruption specifically. I can send more details on it, but it's very high level, and anti-corruption is getting to the top of the agenda for next year. There's also open government partnership session happening. So all this to say that the work that you're doing nationally, the challenges that you're facing nationally in terms of corruption, transparency, accountability are making it to a higher level, and there are political opportunities to influence that conversation and to help. Hopefully more resources coming out of those sessions and in the lead up to those sessions that could counter some of the challenges being faced by the Financial Action Task Force recommendations. In a previous, just to go back to some of the previous questions and also to the ones posed here, there's a lot of opportunities for peer-to-peer exchanges. There's regional workshops that are set up in the lead up to HLPF that we encourage you to take part in and participate in, and also getting these regional civil society advocacy platforms to support you nationally. If the international world and New York is too far away and too distant from your reality on the ground, I can totally understand that. So I would really encourage you to speak to your neighboring countries in the region who are facing similar challenges and try to engage as much as possible in those opportunities going forward. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Priya. Other speakers, would you like to address? I think there was one question directed to Deirdre, and if Mandeep and Dima, if you also would want to answer, but please, we are running short of time, just maybe 1 minute each.
I don't mind coming in very quickly, just to respond to the question about the sustainability of civic space indicators, and the example was used of the Human Freedom Index. I suppose my own feeling would be that civil society needs to have a strong sense of ownership over the civic space indicators that are developed. I think sometimes indicators seem a little technical, a little remote. So this is one of the reasons why Forus is planning to organise capacity development workshops at sort of national and regional level around civic space indicators, and particularly recognising the importance of contextualising and localising these civic space indicators. But we feel that once civil society understands the importance of these indicators and that they can really make a difference in keeping governments, and that the reporting on them every year, whether it's through a spotlight report or whether it's through a VNR, that it will make a difference in terms of keeping the pressure on governments to continue to expand and grow the civic space. So I think, yes, there are dangers there, but I think we can take steps and make sure that through civil society ownership, that sustainability of the indicators can be ensured. Thanks.
Thanks, Deirdre. Mandeep, would you want to answer? Dima?
Sure. Thanks, Jyotsna. I can come in.
Sure,
I just also want to weigh in on the question from Akio about the indexes. And I just say that, there are already civil society-led indexes that are there that measure civic space. The question is the government or our governments or the UN willing to adopt them and to see them, because because they are independently weighed. They, of course, sometimes tell the whole picture about a government's response. And when we see governments, when they go to report at the voluntary national review, or when they go to report to the universal periodic review, the state report oftentimes speaks in very glowing terms about what the official response has been. And we certainly need to have a more independent assessment from a civil society perspective of what the impact of those of the government response is. So I just say that there are plenty of indicators, but the UN needs to be able to adopt civil society and academic-led indicators and see them as as important pieces of information in telling the whole picture. So rather than invent another new set of indicators and create duplication, I would just say that they should be willing to work with civil society and academia on this. I saw there were a few questions about international funding. I think international funding itself remains oftentimes challenging thing. I would not even say, Arjun raised the question about controversial funding. I don't think there's any funding that's necessarily controversial, because this very same governments and representatives oftentimes go to the World Economic Forum and they ask for foreign direct investment, and there are many companies, that come and invest in a country. And those are huge flows of funding, and they are very, very able to flow very easily. But when there's small, tiny amounts of funding for civil society, there are often conditions and there's already restrictions. Civil society is liable under money laundering legislation. Civil society is liable under security legislation. Civil society is liable under regular criminal legislation for misuse of, for overstepping any of these laws in any case. So having another way to reduce funding, which could potentially be used to, to provide a true picture, or to exercise civic freedoms, or to be part of the democratic process, does not seem reasonable. But unfortunately, that's the reality of the times, when international funding has become such a contested term, because there are several international philanthropic and state funders that provide money for international development activities, and they should not be seen as controversial, but unfortunately they are.
Thank you, Mandeep. Dima, do you want to?
I can, but I'll just be very quick, because I would only echo what the other speakers have said. I would just add, at national level, there's also something called the Universal Periodic Review Trust Fund, which is a fund that's available for activities to implement UPR recommendations. So while this is not SDG specific, as I mentioned earlier, they are of course complementary to each other. And if there is a UPR recommendation made to your country on civic space, there is a way to see whether the UPR Trust Fund can be tapped into as a way to try to strengthen civil society activities and civic space more generally. I would also add, on top of foundations, I like what Mandeep was saying, that it's important that international sources of funding should not be seen to be controversial. It's important to have that. But in addition to that, why not look into some businesses as well who have been particularly vocal and supportive of civic space? And we've, of course, been working on engaging business to be more involved in human rights promotion work. We have the guiding principles on business and human rights. So there are surely some businesses that may be willing to provide some funding provided that, of course, all the relevant due diligence work is undertaken to make sure that that these businesses are in line with human rights principles. And then finally, I would just say on the indicators work, of course, always important, we are aware of how the adoption of global indicators is very complex. All we would promote is that the methodology should always be underpinned by human rights, the human rights-based approach, and internationally accepted statistical standards and monitoring methodology. And I would also echo that it would be important not to undermine or displace existing achievements or indicators that, of course, took a lot of efforts to get there, but very much supportive of continuing to find robust evidence-based monitoring of civic space. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dima. Thank you all. And so this leaves me with very little time, and I would just like to summarize very quick points. We heard all the speakers and all the panelists, and we saw that the space is indeed shrinking, and only 3% of the countries have open kind of space. We also heard that SDGs are cherry picked by the government, and how can we create more spaces and more for the civil society to intervene in, to be part of the monitoring and review process of the SDGs, and how can we be more interactive, more participative in the VNR process. We heard about the civil society civic space indicators from OHCHR, 1610, 1607, 1717, 5.5. So these are the new things that we all have to take it forward when while doing the study. And we also have to think about the indicators, the sustainability of the indicators. Of course, there are new and robust indicators that are coming in, but at the same time, we have to also look at the indicators that have already been formed, and how can we make use of it in a sustained manner. And so, and also one thing that, SDGs, obviously that needs to be localized and universalized both, but it has to be a bottom-up approach, and also involving, larger community in the whole system. And how can the spaces be more engaging? And as Priya said, that instead of naming and shaming, how can we get more engaged with the system, and try to be engaged? But at the same time, there's also a question of, as we discussed, that with the political will of the government, how much they want to involve civil society and other stakeholders. But then obviously there is always a room to discuss and communicate. So with this, I would like to quickly close this session. But before that, last but not least, I would like to thank all the interpreters that are doing the pro bonos, and they are Natalia Prio from Madrid, Spain. We have Elizabeth Baca, Mexico City, Mexico. We have Claudia Riva Palacio from Mexico City. We have Sebastian Besser Zug from Buenos Aires, Argentina. Thank you so much for all your interpretation. And and then I'll like to thank all of you, all the speakers, the panelists, the participants, for all your questions. I'm sorry we could not take a lot of questions and they were hand raised. So I make sure that all your questions are answered through emails, and you'll receive the email. We'll also see that all the presentations are also shared with you. And then the next thing would be, we are planning to get into the CSO. We are going to launch a global campaign for expanded civic space indicators. So just look forward to this space, and please get involved in that when Forus announces this campaign. And before that, I would also ask Arturo to come up with a closing poll.
Yes, thank you, Jyotsna. We would like to know if you agree or if you disagree with the following statement. Civil society should be using an expanded range of civic space indicators to monitor the health of civic space in different countries around the world. Please let us know if you agree or if you disagree with this statement. We will give you 15 more seconds to answer. And I think we can share now with you the results. Everyone agrees. Over to you, Jyotsna.
Thank you so much, Arturo, and thank you so much, Forus, for this very interesting session. And with this, I also request that there's a next session, very interesting session on exploring new funding approaches for civil society that is starting at 14:30 UTC GMT. So I look forward to seeing all of you there. And thank you again for all your time and energy. Thank you so much for this great deliberation.
Thank you, Jyotsna.
Thank you, Jyotsna. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thanks all. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.